Free slaves in the North and South lived very different lives during the 1800s. Free slaves in the South worked as laborers, craftspeople, or household servants. They were viewed as a dangerous group of people that had to be contained and, in result, were forbidden to own guns, travel between states freely, or work at certain jobs. Free slaves in the North lived freer lives but were still subjected to lots of discrimination. Most were denied the right to vote, and many were held at low-paying jobs because almost no man wanted to work at them. Segregation hindered children from getting a good school education. For slaves, the working conditions were rough. Slaves awoke in the morning and were put right to work. They worked all day, being overseen by their owner or supervisor. Even after dark, there was lots to be done with carrying water, splitting wood, feeding pigs, and other chores. Slaves that weren't working in the fields worked as carpenters, cooks, or maids. Most slaves were put to work from about the age of 6 until death. Slaves were provided for, but only just enough to stay healthy to work. They were fed and clothed, but received limited resources. While they were poorly taken care of compared to most white Southerners, they did receive medical care. Slaves found many ways to resist slavery in numerous ways, from passive rebellion to open defiance. Passive rebellion included them pretending to be dumb and incompetent of work. Even poisoning their master's food and slaves setting fires to barns started happening. Open rebellion began when slaves were pushed too hard. They refused orders and struck back in violence. Slaves also tried to run away to the north. Thousands of slaves did find freedom through the Underground Railroad. Slave owners tried to control slaves by beating, whipping, or branding them. Slaveholders preferred to have their slaves totally depend on them and treated them like grown-up children. They also kept their slaves as ignorant as possible about the outside world. Slaves who gave constant rebellious trouble were sent to slave breakers, whose methods mainly consisted of violence, fear, and overwork in order to ensue humble, obedient slaves. Community and family life was difficult as a slave. Legally, there were no families for slaves because marriages were not recognized, and technically children belonged to the masters. Because of this, masters were allowed to break up slave families any time to sell a slave. But because of these restrictions, slaves made up their own traditions, which involved jumping the broomstick for weddings, and parents also found time to teach their children good morals and life lessons. Slaves had Saturday and Sunday nights as their own. Saturday nights held social events with both work and fun. Men husked corn, and women would quilt. Slaves made music and enjoyed congregating. Sunday was a day for religion. They went to church, ate, hunted, and told stories. All of these things were ways to lift their spirits and forget about the sorrow of slavery. Slaves created invisible churches to preach about the stories of freedom in the Bible and to express their desire for freedom. In their prayers and spirituals, they gave their longings, sorrows, and hopes for a voice. African Americans came here and adopted a new language, a whole new way of life, and a completely new tradition and religion. Still, they did not forget their African roots. They incorporated tradition in everyday life in ways like story quilts, spirituals, dances, and folk tales. It is important to know and learn the history of our past, and to never repeat the same mistakes again in the future.